but there's a statement in the Pseudo-Clementines attributed to Jesus where Jesus says, be like good money changers, able to tell false coin from true. And I think that's what we want our audiences to do, and that's why we have all this data, to be able to tell false coin from true, and that's where the book of Acts is the battleground.
Your book is a fascinating book, and one of the chapters is actually titled The Vegetarianism of James, and the viewers of this show are quite aware that one of my own main interests is in the early vegetarian teachings of primitive Christianity. I've asserted on this show numerous times that the earliest Christian movement was vegetarian, and these ancient sources that you've cited that are describing Jesus as having this brother James, and James as the head of the church after him, when they describe James, they describe him as a vegetarian. There's many other early Christian sources that describe this early vegetarian form of Christianity, calling them the Ebionites, the Nazarenes. Much of their terminology is similar to what we find in the Dead Sea Scrolls. They seem to be an outgrowth of this Judaic Essene movement. But the thing that had caused me a bit of consternation is that even though the source materials were describing Jesus as having a brother James in charge of the church after Jesus' crucifixion, and James was a vegetarian, and then the Clementine manuscript describing Peter as a vegetarian, and Acts of Thomas describing Thomas as a vegetarian, and so many sources on vegetarianism, mainline scholarship has failed, I believe, to take adequate note of that, and that's why I was very pleased to see your book, James, the Brother of Jesus, actually have a chapter on the vegetarianism of James. And so I want to ask you a question. You're not related to my church. You're a renowned scholar. Would you agree with my assertion that it seems that James, the brother of Jesus, was a vegetarian, and that there was some sort of a strain of Jamesian Christianity that was indeed vegetarian?
Well, absolutely, you're right there. Certainly all the sources tell us these are extra-biblical sources primarily, but also reading between the lines of Paul, you can see that James, because Paul, as it turns out, seems to be James's arch nemesis or arch enemy, that you can see that Paul, in fact, that James is a vegetarian. Whether I'm a renowned scholar or not, even your other people, that's a matter of opinion, but anybody, and that's why we put the data out there, can see this. Yes, we have here in this book, as it starts off, we have a lot of background material, source material, and so on. We start off with one chapter of the first appearance of James in Acts. We go into the picture of James in Paul's letters. We go into the election of James to succeed his brother, and then we get into James's Nazaritism, and then his Rechabitism, and his vegetarianism and abstention from blood and so on, and his clothing, which is similar to your clothing habits, linen, and his bathing habits. So we go into all that kind of material, but it is true that from early church sources, they primarily tell us that James was a vegetarian. But not only James. These sources tell us, well, John the Baptist, regardless of the New Testament picture we get of eating locusts, which I don't think is accurate, I think John the Baptist is in the same mold, vegetarian, bathing sort of individual. The Pseudo-Clementine literature, as I told you, it's not a literature that is orthodox. It's actually an opposition Acts. It is the Acts written in the East against the powers of the Western Church. Acts, which presents a different Peter, a different James, same Paul, but a different Peter and a different James. In Acts we can say Peter is Paulinized. There's an episode in Acts where Peter gets a vision of a tablecloth coming down from heaven with, if you know Jewish dietary regulations, all kinds of forbidden food on it. Lobster, shrimp, I suppose, crabs and so on, snails, snakes. And a voice cries out from heaven saying, "Eat, Peter, eat." And Peter in this episode in the book of Acts says, "No, I have never eaten any unclean thing." That's probably authentic, that Peter had never eaten any unclean thing. It's the vision of the tablecloth that Paulinizes him. And after the voice cries out 3 times, by the way, the fact that Peter doesn't know that he can eat forbidden foods means that Jesus never taught it, even according to Acts. So Acts trips itself up there by trying to Paulinize its Peter. It inadvertently tells us the picture of Jesus we have in these scripture can't be authentic. Otherwise, why would Peter need such a vision? But that being aside, Peter then cries out, the voice cries out, "Eat, Peter, eat," 3 times, and Peter says finally, "I have now learned not to call anything unclean or profane, and not to call any man unclean." And then the Roman centurion comes, sending his servant, so that Peter is prepared to visit his household. But the Pseudo-Clementines give us a totally different Peter. That Peter does not eat forbidden foods, does keep away from all unclean things, is a vegetarian, is a daily bather, rises at the sun before dawn and prays. And what a beautiful Peter that is. To me, the information in the Pseudo-Clementines is 10 times more interesting and 100 times more beautiful than the Peter we get in Scripture. Because the Peter in our Scripture, if you look really carefully, we don't have any picture of him at all. He hardly does anything except argue with Jews, and basically what comes out of his mouth is anti-Semitic invective, and it's not a very, very pretty Peter at all. The Peter in the Pseudo-Clementines is absolutely lovely. The only problem is he's not Paulinized, he's Jamesian.
You're hitting on a really significant point, that there's some early literature, the Clementines and Gospel of the Hebrews, other manuscripts that this group had, which was a sort of a vegetarian form of early Christianity. The fact that Christianity did not continue to be vegetarian means that something happened. And my research has pointed to Paul as being the something that happened, and you just referred to Paul as being pictured in this Essene Christian literature, the Clementines, etc., as being the arch nemesis of Peter and James.
Right.
What can you tell us about that? I mean, Paul is considered by most people as the great hero of Christianity, but in this early Essene Christian literature, he's the arch enemy.
He's the arch enemy. He's the Antichrist incarnate. I think that's the way he was viewed that way in Palestine. Absolutely, that Paul was viewed as the Antichrist. Paul is the originator of the Western form of Christianity as we know it. Paul and his associates, we don't want to say it's all Paul, but basically it's a Pauline view. But that is overseas Christianity in the West, the one that we're familiar with. And these documents that we have, they're all written in Greek. They come down through a Greek retention system, a Greek redaction system. Otherwise, they'd have been written in Syriac, Hebrew, or some other language. They're written in Greek, and they're Greek documents written by Greek for people from a Greco-Roman point of view. But that does not accurately reflect what was going on in Palestine. So we have documents from the time of Christ, as I said, a little before, a little after, doesn't really matter. I don't want to get into the chronological problems, that show us what was going on in Palestine through the eyes of native literature. And also we have all this other literature represented by the Pseudo-Clementines, apocryphal Gospels, reading in between the lines of Paul, early church literature to some extent that is being conserved from Eastern writers that give us a completely other form of Christianity. And it's quite clear that the Christianity that we know in Palestine and this other form was led by James, the brother of not John, who I don't even think existed, and that's an overwrite. That's a Western Christian overwrite in my view, to write the other James out. James was the leader of the early Christian church, and in Palestine for all groups east, all groups from Palestine east. It's only in the West that we get the Paulinized tradition. So of course, our Christians are going to be familiar with the Western material. We're beginning to show them there's another strand, backed up by the scrolls, backed up by a lot of groups that you represent, the Essene groups, the Ebionite groups, a lot of other groups that were functioning over there that actually probably are the earliest form of Christianity and the most authentic strand. Because most people don't realize this. They haven't read the things for themselves. Most people are under authority. Most people have been taught things either in catechism classes or in other religious instructions and take things second, third hand, say that I'm not intelligent enough or I'm not sophisticated enough or I don't have a big enough brain to approach these problems myself. If there was something in it, we'd have already heard of it, and don't realize that that isn't the case at all. that we haven't heard about these things because we didn't have the scrolls previously, and up till this 18th century, we were still being burned at the stake. We didn't have an American Constitution to protect us. And you'll get into your Albigensians, who were all wiped out earlier because they were vegetarians. But absolutely true that there is the data there in the documents when read carefully in Paul's letter that Paul is insulting the leadership of the church. In Galatians, he calls them so-called pillars, not that their importance means anything to me. In Corinthians, he speaks about their being puffed up. Then he speaks that they have weak consciences because they won't eat things sacrificed to idols. In the book of Acts, not eating things sacrificed to idols is the basis of James's in chapter 20, in chapter 15 and chapter 21, James's instructions to overseas communities. So we can tell that Paul is heaping abuse on the Jamesian leadership.
Isn't he even mocking Jamesians' vegetarianism?
Absolutely. In Romans, he says some of these people are so weak that his conscience for him is a euphemism for observing the law, that the law is a crutch so that they're weak. And some, he says, are so weak that they will eat only vegetables. Well, nowadays, we think people who eat vegetables are strong, who only eat vegetables are strong. Yeah. They're resisting the temptation of meat. Paul, as he does almost everything else, turns everything on its ear. Somersaults everything for the benefit, in my view, and I outline it very carefully in all my books, and not only this one, but in the Dead Sea Scrolls and the First Christians, for the benefit of the Greco-Roman world that he represented. Turns it all on their ear and reversed it, and he calls these people weak for being vegetarians. And he means James, Peter, and all the other so-called Jewish apostles of the early church. Who were
actually trained by Jesus.
Who, and whatever James was, so was Jesus.
But before leaving the topic of Paul, I want to just touch on one more thing. Let me clue the viewers into this book. It is titled The Dead Sea Scroll Deception. And this book, although it was not authored by Professor Eisenman, it was authored by Michael Bajent and Richard Lee. The whole book is primarily based on the research of Professor Eisenman. There is a chapter in this book titled Paul, Roman Agent or Informer. And so the last thing I want to do with Paul, Professor Eisenman, is simply look for a moment at motive. And I know you really, really get into this in your book, The Dead Sea Scrolls and the First Christians. I would commend this to the viewers, but let's touch on it here, is if in fact Paul subverted this early Christian movement throughout the vegetarianism, changed a lot of things.
Yeah, Paul said, all things are lawful, all things are permitted me, and eat everything in the butcher shops, eat everything in the market cleans, and don't raise questions of conscience.
Now, if Paul indeed subverted this early Christian Ebionite movement of Jesus and James, the question is, why? Was it simply, his own philosophy he wanted to boldly assert and it happened to be different? Or did he, in fact, like this book asserts, have some sort of ties with the elite of Rome? Do you think he was some sort of species of Roman agent?
Well, that's the way they put ideas, that they basically ripped off of an article we have in this book called, which was delivered to the Society of Biblical Literature in 1984, called Paul as Herodian. Paul as Herodian. You might show that there, which the Bajent and Lee had available to them, which had not previously been printed. So my view of Paul is laid out in that book, and they picked it up in their Dead Sea Scrolls Deception and used their own language. I do believe that Paul had a Roman citizenship. I think I'm the first one that showed that he probably had relations to the Herodian family, because in Romans, in chapter 16, if your audience looks at that chapter, he sends greeting to his kinsman Herodian, Herodion. He says, my relative. And Herodian in Greek is the littlest Herod, the smallest or the youngest Herod. In other words, Paul has a kinsman called the littlest Herod. I already suspected that he was Herodian long before one of my students actually pointed that out to me. It wasn't my idea. A student of mine in the class pointed that out to me. But yes, there is, how did he get his Roman citizenship? That was not an easy thing to come by. He's on, and even in the book of Acts, extremely easy relations with Herodian kings, Agrippa, Bernice, his paramour as sister. They were considered to be in an incestuous relationship. They appear in Acts 26 and 27. Felix, the most brutal governor in Palestine after Pontius Pilate. Josephus says Felix crucified so many people, there wasn't enough room for the crucifixions, nor enough wood for the crosses. Felix's paramour, Drusilla, the sister of Agrippa I. All this we cover in the book. So Paul's on easy terms, even in Acts, with these people. He has an entree into the highest circles. In the letter to the Philippians, Paul sends greetings to the household of Nero. He sends Epaphroditus. We cover Epaphroditus in this book, who is Josephus' publisher, who was Nero's secretary for Greek letters. He sends greetings to people in the household of Nero. So he's got very high relations. I don't know. If he went to Rome and was supposed to have been executed and wasn't, there's only one way that he could have survived such a trip if in some sense he went into service of some kind. The Bajan Lee people speak of that as being an agent or a double agent or an informer, etc., etc., etc. I think in some way Paul was deeply compromised with the Roman authority.
And just briefly...
which is Roman citizenship would imply. Can you imagine Jesus, when he's arrested, pulling out his Roman passport and saying, "Do you arrest Roman citizens?"
Just briefly, am I correct from my reading of the Clementine manuscript that we've been discussing, that there seems to be a description of Paul attempting to kill James, the brother of Jesus?
Oh, absolutely, that's true too, yes. We forgot that, didn't we? In the early career of Paul, when the Acts admits that he's an enemy of the early church, Paul even admits in Galatians that he persecuted the church unto death. I show in my book that there's very strange things going on in the execution of John the Baptist. But also in the Pseudo-Clementines, the recognitions picture Paul as leading an actual physical assault on James and throwing him down the steps. The reason we didn't cover it here was because even the Pseudo-Clementines admit that that didn't cause James's death, but the detail is very, very precise. James broke one or both of his legs, because when later James sends Peter off on his first missionary journey, all this would strike your audience as bizarre, but they've never heard any of it. It's all in the Pseudo-Clementine literature that comes from the 2nd and 3rd century, almost as old as our book of Acts is supposed to be. When James sends Peter off on his first missionary journey, Peter says he's still limping on one foot from the fall he took after Paul attacked him in the temple. That's an incredible detail, and that's down in Jericho, where our Dead Sea Scrolls were more or less found. So, there's a lot of material pointing to an actual physical assault by Paul on James in the early career, and there is other material pointing to the fact that Paul had a hand, early church admits this, in the death of early Christians. I would go so far as to say that it may have been John the Baptist as well, because I'll tell you why the John the Baptist thing is very strange. Paul in Acts is always anxious to cover up all of this material. You know the episode I'm talking about, a famous episode when Paul is let down the wall of Damascus in a basket? Acts says, and Acts is always secondary to Paul's own first-person testimony. Your audience should bear that in mind. When there's a conflict between Acts and Paul's own testimony, which there often is, it's Paul's own testimony that should be preferred. Acts says Paul was escaping down the walls of Damascus to escape from the Jews who wanted to kill him. But Paul in 2 Corinthians says, I escaped down the walls of Damascus in a basket to escape from the representatives of King Aretas. King Aretas was an Arab king in Transjordan, and King Aretas' people were taking vengeance for the death of John the Baptist. So if Paul was an Herodian involved with people like the people who killed John the Baptist, it would make sense that Paul was escaping from the representatives of King Aretas. Acts changes that into anti-Semitism, which is my problem with Acts. It is always moving over into the area of anti-Semitism, and if one wants to know why we have so much anti-Semitism in the Western world, a good place to begin to look for it is in the book of Acts. So the movement you represent actually does a healing process on this, because you remove all of this, what I would consider material unworthy of Christianity, from the table.